In this presentation, I will be discussing the Baroque bassoon. This includes the origins and ancestors of the modern-day bassoon, its use throughout the Baroque era, and how important composers utilize the Baroque bassoon. All of this culminates into the modern instrument we see today. So, what is a bassoon? The bassoon is a woodwind instrument that has been around in some shape or form since the early 14th century. It is technically considered a member of the oboe family because it does not use a mouthpiece and it produces sound by blowing through a double reed. Similar to an oboe, the bassoon reed is tied together with string. However, the bassoon reed is significantly larger and does not use a cork base. The bassoon reed fits onto the bocal, or metal tenon of the bassoon. By blowing through the attached reed, the vibrations then make the sound which is produced through the bell of the bassoon. The bassoon is the largest and lowest pitched instrument of the woodwind family. Its range spans from the B flat, or A in some cases, below the B bass clef, to the F above the treble clef staff. More notes can be achieved, but it is extremely rare in the standard repertoire of the instrument. With a range of over 3 octaves, it is impressive when compared to that of the other woodwinds. The bassoon is most frequently used as an orchestral instrument, though it is also played in small chamber groups, wind bands, and as a solo instrument. Another member of the bassoon family is its larger counterpart, the contrabassoon. The contrabassoon sounds an octave lower than the tenor bassoon, and it is noticeably larger as well. Whereas the bassoon is 8 feet long unrolled, the contrabassoon is 16 feet long when unrolled. The contrabassoon is also not held by performers in the same way as the tenor bassoon. While a bassoon is typically held in place by a sling or seat strap, a contrabassoon has a peg similar to the bass clarinet or the cello, which is used to hold the instrument upright for the musician. While the contrabassoon existed during the Baroque era and was used by composers such as J.S. Bach, it would not be found commonly until much later in the 18th century when composers such as Mozart and Beethoven would discover its intense timbre. The origins of the bassoon are shrouded in mystery, and exactly when and where the bassoon was invented is pretty obscure. It is known that in countries such as Spain, Italy, France, Germany, and England, there are reports of instruments that are bassoon-like as early as the 15th century. Some common names for the precursors to the bassoon include fagot, fagato, dulcian, and kurtal. It is with these various names that the confusion about the origins of the early bassoon come into play. Across Europe, there are various written accounts and very few physical artifacts of instruments labeled and referred to as by various names that all seem to function in the same way. There's also quite a lot of mislabeling that happens in texts during this time. A reference might be made to a dulcian, but in reality it was not the actual instrument being used. Or there have been artifacts that are classified or labeled as early bassoons by the original users, but are nothing of the sort. This history of mistakes in documenting the path of the early bassoon only adds to the obscurity of the bassoon's origins and development throughout time. Throughout the centuries, tropes have been created to explain the creation of the bassoon. These serve to confuse the issue further, making the true origin of the bassoon even less attainable. Beginning in the 17th century, individuals would come up with a theory as to who invented the bassoon or how it came into existence. These were typically based on specific people and focused primarily on the bassoon's name, invention, structure, and use. 5 of these theories took root across the centuries and have permeated our modern culture. Some are even taken as fact, though there is very little evidence to support that position. For example, many people say it's called a fagot because that word means bundle of sticks, and the bassoon looks like a bundle of sticks. While the etymology of that word is correct, and it may very well look like a bundle of sticks, this is not based in fact, and is just an assumption made centuries ago. The creation myth of the bassoon made up of these theories has been functional and accepted by many who do not pursue further evidence. However, once additional reading and research are completed, it is obvious that these theories are nothing more than myths. The most common theory of the origin of the bassoon is that the dulcian, the most popular candidate, originated in Italy and spread throughout Europe before 1600. So, what is a dulcian? The dulcian is the most popular choice of the direct ancestor of the modern bassoon. It is a single-pieced, double-reeded wind instrument. The dulcian, which was named such because of its subdued and sweet sound, is a cousin to other instruments that were also popular during the Baroque era, and it is possible that these instruments were also attributed to some of the features of the modern-day bassoon. These instruments, the shawm and the pommer, are similar in size and function to the dulcian and other instruments, and both instruments use double reeds. The shawm is more similar to the modern oboe, but in terms of how the three instruments are similar, all three have conical bores, similar key technology, and they all utilize a crook and double reed for sound production. All of these the dulcian functioned mostly as a basso continuo and was very important in tuning. It was even used as a bass and accompaniment in some ensembles of Gregorian chant. Aside from this, there is very little music written for the dulcian. The early uses for this instrument were through non-written music, such as memorized or improvisational works. Around the year 1600, which is the beginning, so to speak, of the Baroque era, specific repertoire for the dulcian began to emerge. One such composition was a series of sonatas written by Giovanni Antonio Bertoli in Venice in 1645. While composed later than other works, this piece was the first known collection that was strictly written for a solo instrument. As mentioned before, the dulcian is believed to have originated in Italy, and there are many references as early as 1539 of an instrument referred to as a dolzaina or dolzain. These instruments, used in Florentine weddings and festivals, were very likely dulcians, and in Venice, the dulcian is believed to have been used as early as 1559. Throughout Europe, there are references to the dulcian or dulcian-like instruments being used. German-speaking courts had a particularly rich interaction with the dulcian, as did England, Spanish colonies, France, and Scandinavia. Whether the dulcian was brought to these areas by composers, musicians, or by rich individuals who happened upon them, the dulcian was a popularly used instrument before the Baroque era and throughout it as well. Despite its popularity in the 16th and 17th century, by the early 1700s, the dulcian was all but forgotten. It was instead replaced by what we now call the Baroque bassoon, a four-pieced double reed wind instrument. The Baroque bassoon is believed to have appeared in France in the court of King Louis XIV in approximately 1668. This is significant because before this, no bass woodwind instrument is reported to have been played in the royal chapel before this instance. Nicholas II Hauterive is credited with being the musician who played this instrument at the court, and his family is the ones who produced these instruments. It can only be assumed that the Baroque bassoon played by Hauterive was composed of 4 individual pieces. However, by 1685, the makeup of the Baroque bassoon was solidified and many artifacts exist. The instrument still possessed a conical bore, much like its dulcian predecessor, and it still folded onto itself to reduce the size. But now the body of the bassoon was broken up. The pieces include the boot joint, where the curved bore resides, the long joint, a separate tenor joint, which was a new addition, and a bell which sits atop the long joint. Previously, there would not have been a tenor joint, and the instrument simply would have been double-bored. The tenor joint made the key system of the bassoon much more user-friendly and efficient. The important distinctions between the Baroque bassoon and the dulcian include the further extension of the bell, which allows the instrument to play a whole note lower to a B-flat 1, the redistribution of tone holes across the instrument, and the overall size of the bore. Whereas the dulcian was wide and conical, the Baroque bassoon was much narrower, changing the timbre. Each separate piece of the Baroque bassoon could also be tuned, and is an important aspect during the Baroque period. Across Europe and beyond, tuning was not a standard practice. For example, the royal chapel in France turned to A4 equals 390, whereas the pitch of choice in Venice during this time was A4 equals 430 to 440. So, being able to tune individual tenons or tone holes was crucial. Lastly, the crook, or bocal as it is now called, was significantly lengthened, and the tenor joint where it was attached was shortened. This changed the overall dimensions of the Baroque bassoon and is the layout for the instruments which we use today. The French Baroque bassoon would spread throughout Europe and continue to the growing popularity of new and improved Baroque bassoon. Much of the exportation of the bassoon can be attributed to the popularity and allure of the court of Louis XIV. People everywhere wanted to emulate the French court, and this included their style of music. Across Europe, French musicians would find employment in foreign courts, and with them they brought the bassoon as well as other Baroque woodwind instruments. The primary purpose of the bassoon in France outside of performances with the Royal Chapel was within the opera, theatre italien, and the military. The use of instrumentalists at the Royal Chapel originated after the arrival of French composer Lully. He would then use the bassoon within his various works, making Lully the first prominent composer to utilize the bassoon. Lully used the bassoon as a bass alongside the oboes, but when his predecessor, Jean-Philippe Rameau, began to compose for the Royal Chapel, he would utilize the Baroque bassoon in an entirely new way. From this point forward, the bassoon would take on a greater role within the instrumental music community. It was used as a bass instrument, but not solely, and more composers would continue to expand the role of the Baroque bassoon in their compositions. In England, Scotland, and other English colonies, the French Baroque bassoon was in use as early as 1677 and was referred to as the basse de hautbois because of its relation to the oboe. In the court of King Charles, 4 French musicians were employed in 1677, and by 1678, 3 more found employment in the Royal Chapel of England. By the start of the 18th century, the French-style bassoon was being advertised and imported to England. Composers such as Henry Purcell and Jean Blow began scoring the bassoon in many of their orchestral works, and it became more commonplace to see bassoons used in various settings. George Friedrich Handel used the Baroque bassoon in a number of his compositions after his arrival to England in 1710. The bassoon would be found in a number of his concerti grossi and oratorios, including one of his most famous compositions, The Messiah. In summary, the Baroque bassoon's influence in England was profound. And because of this influence, composers from around the world who visited cities such as London and Edinburgh would interact with this new and interesting instrument. The Baroque bassoon was also very frequently used in the German-speaking states starting in around 1696. Instrument makers, and therefore bassoon makers who operated within the boundaries of what we would call Germany today, came from a rich history of musical instrument creation. The skill many individuals had for creating instruments combined with the guild of wood turning would create an environment for the creation of bassoons across the German-speaking states. In 1696, a Dulcian maker, J.C. Denner, requested permission from his guild to craft French-style Baroque bassoons and other Baroque-style wind instruments in the German-speaking state of Nuremberg. He defended his case by mentioning the invention of such instruments, such as the 3-keyed Baroque bassoon, which had been completed by the French approximately 12 years prior. Evidently, his plea was approved because there are artifacts from this time period which have a stamp on the bell signifying who made the instrument. These instruments were made by J.C. Denner and his son, and they were distinctive in shape and style. While they were still functionally French Baroque bassoons, the upper joints were ornamented with raised rings serving as key mounts, and a, quote, bulbous and decoratively turned bell with a reverse tapered bore, end quote. There is a painting, Der Pfeifenmacher, by Christoph Weigel, done in Nuremberg in 1698, which illustrates both a Dulcian and a Baroque bassoon being created, and this image matches the descriptions of instruments made by J.C. Denner and his son during this time. While the French-style Baroque instruments spread throughout various German cities, one city was perhaps the most influential in the development of the Baroque bassoon. Dresden, the seat of the Saxon court, would become one of the most cosmopolitan and artistic cities in the Germanic region of Europe, supposedly only rivaled by Versailles. Beginning in the mid-1600s, the Elector Prince of Dresden commissioned an opera house to be built in Dresden. French and Italian operas and plays would be then performed there for the entertainment of the court. This was the start of a rich history of musical patronage the court of Dresden would uphold throughout the Baroque era. Sometimes called the Augustan Golden Age, the years of 1694 to 1763 would prove to be very prosperous and musically successful for the people of Dresden. Eventually, the Dresden Court Kapelle would become the forefront Baroque orchestra in Germany, and it would include a full section of French-style woodwinds. It was through the Dresden Kapelle that a number of influential composers would be placed in a position to write for an instrument that they had not before encountered, the French Baroque bassoon. As the bassoon gained popularity in Dresden and other European cities, it became more popular, traveling through musicians and composers looking for work. It is during the Baroque era that a great many works for bassoon were commissioned and written by a variety of important composers. When we look at prevalent Baroque composers, many who utilized the bassoon in their larger compositions were situated closer to the end of the Baroque era. However, the compositions are still very much in the Baroque style. Though, it is important to note that since there is no definite start or end to an era of musical style, these composers utilized a style of bassoon that was without question Baroque. They are worth mentioning. First, the use of the bassoon by Georg Friedrich Handel, a famous German and English composer during the early 18th century. Handel is regarded as one of the most prolific composers of the Baroque era, and he spent the majority of his career in London as of 1710. It was here that Handel would drastically alter the landscape of opera in England among dozens of other compositions. In multiple compositions, Handel used the Baroque bassoon's unique and refreshing timbre to add color. Handel would use the bassoon in his Concerti Grossi, Opus 3, No. 1, and in the fourth of what are known as the coronation anthems. He would also use the bassoon as more than a basso continuo and push the instruments to its timbral and technical limits. In some works, the bassoon would play above their standard range, with the tenor or alto voices accompanying the oboes in small wind trios. In others, such as Handel's Music for Royal Fireworks, the bassoon was used to play in almost warlike fashion, extending to the bottom of their range. It is interesting to note that the sheer number of bassoons that Handel scored for this specific composition. At a time when bassoon was not always accessible and not frequently used, his request for 12 bassoons and 1 contrabassoon is incredibly important. Through Handel's use and exposure of the Baroque bassoon, it inspired more musicians to take up the newer instrument, expanding the force of individuals who knew how to play the Baroque bassoon. Next would be George Philipp Telemann. Telemann is most importantly referenced for his composition of his Sonata in F minor, a 4-movement work which pushed the boundaries of the technical skill of bassoon players. Composed in 1728, this piece was written at what is commonly considered the end of the Baroque era, and it is still a popular work to perform today. It is a challenging piece even on a modern bassoon, making it all the more interesting when observed through the historical lens. Composers during this time did not seem to mind that the French bassoon only contained 6 basic finger keys and a fraction of the thumb keys it now possesses. They wrote complex, interesting, and challenging music for this instrument, earning it a place as not only an ensemble instrument, but a solo instrument as well. Next, J.S. Bach's use of the bassoon is interesting as records show transposition errors and disputes. While he did use the Baroque bassoon in dozens of compositions, both with and without vocalists, he often used the bassoon as a source of basso continuo and not much else. Evidence also points to discrepancies within the scores, which show transpositions when there should not be any. It is very possible that in certain circumstances Bach was unable to find a proper bassoon or bassoonist, and was therefore forced to use a Dulcian, and he wrote the part for Dulcian instead of bassoon. This is rare but possible based on records from Bach's time in the Weimar court. Bach frequently used the bassoon in a variety of different genres, cantatas, and orchestral works alike, and very rarely he used the bassoon in a melody. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, Antonio Vivaldi was an incredibly influential composer when it came to creating repertoire for an instrument that mainly played a supportive role within the bass line. During his time in Venice, Vivaldi was employed by the Pieta Orphanage, just known as the Pieta, from 1703 to 1740 with intermittent breaks. It was here that he would coach and compose music for the young women who lived within the orphanage. These young girls and women would become extremely good musicians, and individuals would come from miles around to hear them perform. In order to highlight their talent, Vivaldi would compose more than just ensemble works. He composed over 500 concerti solely for the purpose of these young musicians. Of these concerti, 37 were completed bassoon concertos. In all, Vivaldi composed 39, but 2 of them are incomplete and therefore not performed. Inventories of the Pieta indicate that there were bassoons in use there as early as 1662, long before Vivaldi began working at the orphanage, but no other instructor of the bassoon is mentioned or heard of. Of Vivaldi's 22 chamber concertos, 17 of them call for the use of the Baroque bassoon. Of his 10 concerti scored for multiple instruments, the bassoon is used frequently to augment the treble lines, and in 3 of his operas, the arias include a bassoon obbligato. When one looks at the wealth of solo and chamber works provided for the bassoon by Antonio Vivaldi, it is impossible to overlook the influence that had upon the Baroque music environment. Not only did it create a large amount of repertoire that would remain relevant through the 21st century, but it also increased the public awareness and interest of the Baroque bassoon. Individuals would come to the Pieta and be amazed by the new and unique sound which they would hear. That sound was the timbre of the bassoon, and from there the word spread. It is thanks to Vivaldi, among others, that the bassoon has found a solidified place in the orchestral and solo performing worlds. In conclusion, the Baroque bassoon and its development beyond the Baroque era relies heavily upon composers such as J.S. Bach, Handel, and especially Antonio Vivaldi. Without them, the evolution of the double-reeded dulcian and the innovations that led to the three-keyed Baroque bassoon would have been meaningless. As is obvious today, the bassoon is an important aspect of our performing ensembles. It is a strong melodic instrument and a steady, capable bass line. It has a unique timbre that enriches any ensemble that it is a part of, and none of that would be possible without the evolution of the Baroque bassoon. Today's bassoons are quite different from the Baroque, and it is only fitting that an already versatile and unique instrument developed more throughout the classical and romantic periods. Throughout those times, 2 forms of bassoon were created. The French style became more refined, and the German people decided to create their own version of the bassoon. Today, French bassoons are not used very commonly, and the German is more popular. There are now 13 thumb keys on modern bassoons, and trill keys have also been added for ease of playing. And today, while it is rare and even the bassoon also contains a low A extension on many professional level tenor bassoons, increasing the range all the way down to an A1. In short, the modern bassoon is an important aspect of the modern day orchestra, and would not be so without the influence of the Baroque bassoon.